So thanks everyone for being here today. We have some real experts on this panel, so looking forward to hearing your views. I think we'll start with Victoria. Victoria, you're a veteran in EU policy. You have over a decade of experience. So I'd love to hear from your perspective what your view is on the current situation of EU policy making for tech and what you see in store in future.
Thanks so much, Catriona. Maybe just a few words first on who the European Tech Alliance is. It's a group of companies that have been successful in Europe. They're born in Europe, they grew in Europe, they have the operation in Europe, and so Europe is really the first market. And they really care about getting involved in EU rules because harmonization, being able to grow at a European Union level, at a European level, is very important for them. So what we have seen over the last years is really lots of regulation coming their ways, which sometimes can be a bit overwhelming. And so today, we are really in a mood to comply, and we really like to comply. It's great to have great rules to make sure that we have fair competition, that consumers are well protected, and so on. Now the question is how much European companies are at risk with that compliance burden and that administrative red tape compared to more international companies, and the cost for compliance, the challenges to find developers to implement those rules. So we are kind of looking forward to say, okay, well, we have done an amazing job over the last decades with lots of rules. Let's now maybe think about where the gaps. Are the rules well targeted? Do we understand all the different business models and how we can still compete and be an innovator in Europe, not only in regulation, but also in competitiveness?
Okay, interesting. And Tasos, you are also quite the EU policy expert. Would you agree with what Victoria says, or do you have a different take on some of the issues right now at EU Tech?
No, completely. Yeah, I think so Victoria is very much right because first of all, a few words for Mozilla. You might know us for the Firefox browser, but we do have also other products like Mozilla VPN or the Pocket Read It Later application. Yeah, the mission of Mozilla, what we always have in mind is an open and accessible internet, and one that has privacy and security at its core. We've seen legislation the past years from EU, but also other regions, focusing towards more, obviously, privacy elements, also more security elements, but also more pro-competition, pro-choice for users. So it's completely like what Victoria said, and definitely agree on the effective enforcement of legislation, right? So there is one side of passing legislation and some great piece of legislation like GDPR or the EMEA, for example, right, the Digital Markets Act. On the other hand, you also need to make sure, and that's for policymakers, that they deliver on what was agreed on. And effective enforcement, effective remedies, and then Jon also is very, very much aware of European legislation, is where now the sweet spot lies, I guess, for EU policy making. Of course, there's a lot to be done. Also in the new mandate, we're going to have a new commission, there's going to be a new parliament, European Parliament, priorities are there, but we should not forget about effective enforcement as well. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. And just to pick up on a couple of things that you've mentioned. So, Victoria, you mentioned that, yes, we do need good policies, but we also need to be able to make sure that companies also have the sort of workforce and the developers there to be able to actually, enact that compliance. And Tasos, you also mentioned that we need to make sure that the policies are sort of fit for purpose in that way, right? So I wonder, Hugo, from your perspective at Mirakl, how you viewed that, and then how your company's taken the decision to actually have your role as a public policy person. So yeah, I'd love to hear more from your perspective.
Do we really have the choice? And the answer is basic. It's no. We don't have the choice. When you look at the regulation and the way it affects the tech roadmap, it's very striking. We have done a study at Mirakl to see how much does it cost to comply with the regulation. And each regulation, each compliance project that we have to cope with, it's 1 million investment. It's a team of 6 devs, a full squad for 6 months that is basically carved out from growth, from innovation project to regulation topic. So it's a huge amount, because when you factor that to the number of text, and the inflation is not always only about prices, it's also about the number of text that we have. You were talking, Tasos, about the DMA, but there is also the DSA, there is the AA Act, there is the Data Act, and all those texts, all those European texts have their equivalent in all the 27 countries that we have in Europe. We are Mirakl, a French company, and we have to also cope with the adaptation of the French right, to the French law, to the DSA. So it's not only about the texts that are voted and are adopted at the European level, it's also about the local text. So the question is, for us as a tech industry, how do we cope between, and how do we choose between the regulation, the compliance with the regulation that has been adopted, and the growth and the innovation that we can bring? And it's a very tough choice. And back to your question, we don't really have the choice. So it's also a call for the policymakers to recognize that what they are implementing, what they are deciding, has also an impact on our innovation in the companies.
Okay. And Jon, what's your take on that? Because you're a CEO of a company, a software company. It's quite rare to see a CEO of a tech company engaging in EU policy, even sitting here on this panel. So it's refreshing. But I do wonder if then what Hugo says about the sort of trade-off between compliance versus growth, if you've had that experience in your company, or what's brought you to be engaged in EU policy making.
I mean, for me, it's a totally different thing. I mean, we're making web browsers. So basically, our competitors are Microsoft, Google, and Apple, and Mozilla. But I think I've focused on the other guys. And the reality is, if you look at it, they control our environment. When they decide, for example, hey, you can't be here, which you may think, hey, they couldn't do that, could they? But they can. I mean, for example, when Microsoft came with their, I mean, this is a little bit back in time, and this is my second browser company. So first Opera, now Vivaldi. But you go a little bit back in time, and there's, okay, Microsoft comes with a Windows Mobile kind of update. Up until that time, most phones in the market were shipping with our browser. Then the update came, and we couldn't be installed. Or on the on the iPhone, we have to use WebKit. Actually, initially, when we launched Opera Mini on the iPhone, there was people were expecting that wouldn't be possible. So at the one level, do we get access to be on the operating system? At the other level, do they have million warnings about not kind of being there? Are there other elements there? And for me personally, then there's the other side, which is things like privacy and the like. Now, you look at companies like Facebook and the like, and they have algorithms that basically make people hate each other. They know it, but it's good for business. I mean, to me, these companies are proving that they're ethically challenged, and they need to be regulated to do the right thing. So I think it can be a problem for smaller companies, but in reality, we need to regulate the big guys because they're in the position to do the most damage, and they seem to be not really able to help themselves.
It's interesting. I wonder if there's a way to regulate some of the bigger guys without having a negative effect then on the kind of medium or smaller ones.
Go for it.
Digital Markets Act.
Digital Markets Act, exactly. So the Digital Markets Act, as we are not in a room of EU jargon expert, there is a new law at European level to make sure that the markets are more fair and that focus on gatekeepers, which are basically the one that Jon just mentioned. And we agree with size come great responsibilities, and we need companies to take them on board, and being successful and being big is successful. So that's a great part of the job, but then you have to take responsibilities, and you cannot put in place unfair practices that potentially the Vivaldi group is facing. Now, it's also very important that policymakers, and that's where I kind of want to put a bit of nuance in the debate, having large, small, and medium members. Most of the time, policymakers are making the long story very short. thinking that they're going after the big ones, but in practice, it's more harming the medium and the smaller ones. And so that's where we kind of want to make sure that we have proportionate rules, that it's risk-based approach, and that the different business model is understood. If I have to give one very basic example that's currently all the time in the media news, is the nuance between a marketplace and a retailer. Sometimes policymakers think that when you buy online, it's a marketplace, but that's not necessarily the case. The question is it an intermediary, someone facilitating a shop with a consumer, or is it a shop directly selling to the consumer? And for instance, just to name one example, Shein, which is for the moment the ultra fashion retailer based in China, isn't complying with any European rules because it's a retailer, so all the intermediary rules, Hugo mentioned the Digital Services Act, are not applying to that company. They're not based in Europe. So these are kind of very important that policymakers understand the different business model, understand how they operate, understand better the market. And that's what the European Tech Alliance tries to do, is to explain what's happening on the ground, to make sure that consumers are well protected, to make sure that competition is fair, and to make sure that privacy is also respected, among many other topics.
If I may pile on the example of e-commerce, because it's very interesting also on the other side. Mirakl, we are helping retailers to fight back against the big tech by using the same tool, the marketplace that you were mentioning. So we have the Carrefour, we have the Leroy Merlin, the Macy's, the Boohoo, the Tasos that are working with us on deploying their marketplace. So they're becoming also regulated by the DSA. But they are retailers and they don't know how to cope with the regulation. So we have to intermediate also the regulation for them, to explain them what will be the new rules, how they have to cope with that. And in fact, the innovation that they are bringing in their market, in their activity with the marketplace is the best way finally to fight back against the big tech giants. One example, one figure, in France, Amazon was 23% of market share. Since the developments of the retailers adding the marketplace activity on their e-commerce website, it dropped to 18%. So they lost 5% market share. Full stop. The innovation is the solution also to the hegemony of the big tech giants.
Okay. And in terms of innovation, do we think that the EU is doing enough to keep promoting innovation, making sure that there's regulations where there's problems, maybe with some of the bigger players that you guys have mentioned, but also making sure that smaller companies can continue to innovate and there's more, we continue to have more innovation on an EU level for startups? Go for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there is definitely willingness, right? Like there is, legislation has been driven a lot around pro-innovation or pro-competition the past years. Again, we go back to enforcement, what we talked about. And like something that I really, really want to stress as well is that here we are, I think like before you asked the audience like how many people are familiar with EU policy making, and it's quite cumbersome, right? It's quite complicated, obviously, like as every political process. But what we definitely need as well, and what we've identified as Mozilla, is that there is a gap between what policymakers are thinking, that they need to have like evidence-based and fact-based policy making, to what actually is happening on the ground. So we need to bridge that gap, bring like together the policymakers, the regulators, and the community together. The community, be it the users, or be it technical experts, be it like people that they actually know how to run code, people that they know what software is about. You know, like this, we need to merge them, and that's what we try to do at least at Mozilla. If we merge them, then I think like then policymakers will start realizing that there is something out or further than just big tech corporations, because when they legislate, that's what they have in mind. Then you have like the one-size-fits-all solutions that they might not be always ideal, but you might also have like legislation with unintended consequences to innovation, right? So open source, for example, has been widely impacted from certain recent initiatives around cybersecurity, whereas the intention of the European Commission has always been to promote open source. So, you know, we have like this sort of discrepancy. So I think like we need to somehow like, and that's our role, I guess as well, like to bridge these two.
I think also, I mean, they are learning, right? I mean, we have the GDPR, and we have the irritating kind of pop-up that comes up. And the reality is, obviously, that's a problem because you're seeing it everywhere, so you just click it away or whatever. I think, I mean, there are better ways. Now, personally, I think it should be okay, you are allowed to do this, and no, you're not allowed to do this. There shouldn't be a question. And I think, I mean, that's one of the things that I'm pushing for is kind of when it comes to data usage, there are certain things that you can do and there are certain things that you can't do. And you shouldn't be having to ask people, because if you're having to ask, then you're doing something wrong.
Okay. One point I'd also wanted to add is the importance of consistency among EU rules. We started talking about compliance, having EU law that you have to comply with and implement. And what's sometimes challenging is that each policymaker wants to add its little piece to the text. We're not necessarily discussing it with other colleagues working on other texts. And so we end up with sometimes a patchwork of rules. And when you're a company, you're like, okay, text A says that I need to do something like that, and text B says totally the opposite. So they conflict or they overlap in a different way. And when you're a company, it's extremely difficult to say, what should I do? Should I go for A or should I go for B? And so it would be extremely useful if policymakers would also work more closely together, make sure that there is real consistency, real harmonization among the text. That will kind of reduce the burden for company compliance, and it will also make sure that the puzzle comes together and that companies can grow more successfully in Europe.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that there's a long way to go, but in terms of how policymaking has evolved, things do seem to be getting somewhere. There seems to be more understanding from EU policymakers of tech, of what could be upcoming. Of course, legislation is never going to move as fast as technology, but it does seem like things are potentially going in the right direction. I know, again, that it's almost lunchtime, so everyone's really desperate, desperate for us to wrap up so they can go eat. So we will wrap up here. I just wanted to invite you all to say, one last closing statement on how you see the future of EU policy making, or what your recommendations would be to policymakers. So we'll start with you, Hugo.
I have the privilege to start, so we do a call for action to Victoria and all the people in the room to join EUTA, because we need more European companies, European startups that are focusing on influencing the EU rules, the regulations that are adopted at EU level. It has been, I mean, the amount that is spent by the big tech companies in Europe needs to be balanced by a true involvement of European companies in policymaking too.
Nice. Ewan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about the Digital Markets Act. And the reason for that is basically because I've been dealing with this for such a long time. One of the clauses I'm really enthusiastic about is the anti-circumvention clause.
Okay.
Because we basically found that our competitors, they always have a way to get around things. So I think that's really important. Personally, I would then like them to take on basically data collection and ban the use of personal data for marketing purposes or for profiling users for any other kind of good purpose. I mean, it just stop these things because the damage is too big. So I'm still fighting for that. We made a little cat video you can look at banspying.org. Yeah.
I'm sure we'll all look forward to seeing the cat video. Tasos?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it always sounds that we're complaining about policymakers, right? And I mean, it's largely the case in many occasions. Of course, like, we need to give credit where it's due, and I think like the EU has done a lot compared to other regions if we see it in holistically, right? Like when it comes to all the issues that we've been talking about, competition, privacy, security, user choice, and so on. So definitely, like, my sort of recommendation or wish list, like for the next mandate, will include that as well. Like, keep going towards that direction. Making sure GDPR is properly enforced, of course. Making sure the EMEA, the Digital Markets Act, is effectively enforced and with clear remedies. Making sure that there is a clear prohibition or ban on deceptive designs, on everything that Jon mentioned that I completely agree as well. Making sure that users can actually switch apps change their default browsers, which is usually, obviously, coming from big tech. So there's a lot of things out there that can be further done. But we are definitely heading in the right direction. So yeah, we should not be complaining too much as long as we're vigilant that we're there and we're assisting policymakers as well in their job, right? Like on delivering what they
very
have to do.
important to help them as well. And Victoria?
I think I'm going to end with just a motto for European tech, for European rules. It's very important that European companies are heard, taken into consideration when we are creating rules in Europe. And this needs to happen when the rules are assessed. Is the market fit for purpose? Do we have fair competition? Are there gaps? And what should we do? When we decided we should do something about it, that the rules are targeted, taking the variety of business model into consideration, making sure that the puzzles and the EU rules are coming together instead of conflicting. And then when it comes to enforcement, guaranteeing that the enforcement is properly done with having the variety of company into consideration, taken into account, and that companies are also working hand in hand with authorities, because sometimes authorities can also challenge each other between the competition authority, the data protection authority, the consumer authority, and we want to work with all of them and that they also work more together, because digital is really a cross-sector activity. So that's a very good point.
Thank you. That was a lot of information to digest, so I hope that it's been interesting. We'll, of course, all be here, so we can have anyone's invited to have further conversations about these issues. But I wanted to thank you all for this discussion and for being here and for continuing with your efforts as well to engage with policymakers and make sure that they have the information they need to make good rules. So thanks, everyone.